Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for this webinar this afternoon. My name is Saneet from RSTP. It's currently just past 1 o'clock. It's 1:02 Eastern at the moment. And we're going to give people a couple more minutes so that they can join us, and then we'll get started with the webinar. So we'll be back on air in a couple of minutes, and then we'll get started with the webinar this afternoon. So thank you once again for joining. Okay, so we are going to get started with the webinar this afternoon. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. My name is Saneet, and I'm from the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. And with us today, we have colleagues and staff from IRCC. So presenting today will be Matthew and Samia, and also they will also be on our Q&A panel along with Tracy from IRCC. The purpose of today's webinar is to try and understand IRCC's post-arrival assurance activities by working through a scenario of a reported case together. So over the course of the last year and a half, we've done a number of different webinars on the post-arrival assurance process. You may have attended some workshops where that was also discussed, and that was also discussed at the SAR conference last year. But what we're really hoping to do today is to see what that looks like in practice, because some of you may not have been through the case review process as a SAR, and you may be wondering what it looks like in practice. So that's the idea of today. We're going to work through a scenario of a reported case together. This is actually part one of a two-part webinar. So in part one today, we're going to introduce the case scenario, and we'll follow the case scenario up until the results of the case review letter is issued by IRCC's Resettlement Services Assurance Team. And what we'll do in next week's webinar on Monday, January 20th, at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, we'll look into the three options that are presented to the sponsoring group by IRCC's Resettlement Services Assurance Team, and then we'll also look into breakdown and defaults. So we'll be following the same case scenario over the course of two webinars, and today we'll follow it up until the point the results of the case review letter is issued. And if you want the details of next week's webinar, part two, the details of that webinar was shared via the SAR listserv last week, as well as the RSDP bulletin. Okay, so I've just had a couple of comments. There's a couple of audio issues. So if you're also experiencing audio issues, please let me know through the question box. I've had two comments so far that there's potentially audio issues, that the line isn't clear or I'm breaking up, or one person is saying that they can't hear me. So if there are audio issues, please do let me know. We'll try and figure that out. So a couple of comments coming in saying that they can hear me clearly. So to those attendees that are having audio issues, when I'm not sure if it's on our end or if it's on your end in your computer. But hopefully the audio issues do improve over the course of the webinar. So getting back to the webinar, just a reminder before we go into the webinar that case-specific questions will not be answered during the course of this webinar. If you do have any case-specific questions, you are encouraged to reach out to IRCC's Resettlement Services Assurance Team directly. If you do have any case-specific questions that relate to real-life situations that your SAR or your CGs or co-sponsors may be dealing with at the moment when it comes to post-arrival financial and settlement support standards or any post-arrival issues that you may be experiencing. We're also having some technical issues with our colleagues from IRCC when it comes to them joining us. So they are online, but they've only been able to join us via telephone. And because they've only been able to join us via telephone, they'll still be able to present, but they won't necessarily be able to see some of the questions coming in. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and answer as many questions as possible over the course of this webinar. And any questions that are not answered today will receive a follow-up in writing, and that follow-up in writing will be given to all attendees, and there may be some links to some additional resources or references within those responses. We're just having an issue where IRCC staff are not able to join via computer, and they are not able to view the questions as they come in. So if your question is not answered today during the webinar, just rest assured that it will be followed up by us in writing, and you will receive a response to your question. So with that out of the way, we're going to look at the agenda for today's webinar. So as we always do, we're going to start off with an overview of the webinar control panel. And then for a couple of minutes, we're going to have a recap on IRCC's post-arrival assurance activities. So we'll look into who conducts those activities, what activities they conduct, why those activities are being conducted, and how they conduct those activities. We'll then look into the processing timeline for post-arrival assurance activities, and you may be familiar with this timeline already because it was presented by Ron at last year's SAR conference, and it was also included in various bundles of resources that we've given out over the course of our training sessions and webinars in the past year or so. And then we're going to go into the case scenario. So we'll look into the case scenario, and we'll look to see what stages that case goes through when it's being monitored by IRCC, and we'll also see how they handle the case and what the different letters are that will be issued by IRCC. And then we'll go into Q&A, but like I said, we are having a couple of technical issues, so we may or may not be able to answer all questions that come in today. So this is the webinar control panel, and for those of you that are joining us via a computer or laptop, you should be able to see this somewhere on your screen. And this is the control panel that you can use to interact with us over the course of this webinar. So if you do have any questions or there's any issues with the audio or with viewing the presentation, please do send those questions and those issues in by using the question box. You can just type your question in or the issue and it will pop up on my screen. If you have a microphone attached to your computer and voice over IP functionality, you can also raise your hand. So when we come to the Q&A part of the webinar, if you have your hand raised, we'll be able to unmute you and you can ask your question in person. And just again, for those that have joined us slightly late, that we are having technical issues today, unfortunately, with the webinar platform. So we may or may not be able to answer all questions live during this webinar, but all questions will receive a written response and all attendees will receive that response after the webinar. Also available to download using the webinar control panel are a couple of handouts. So if you look at the handout section of the control panel, you'll see that there are a couple of IRCC resources available to download. So there's the examples of documents handout that is also available on the RSTP website, and we'll show you where you can find that a bit later on. And there's also a couple of documents that relate to today's case scenario. So one of the handouts is the case scenario. So if you would like to download that and have that up on your screen or print it out so you can follow along as we go through this case scenario, you are welcome to do so. And there's also 2 letters that have been prepared by IRCC's Resettlement Services Assurance team for this webinar. And one of those letters is the request for information letter. It's an example of a request for information letter that they've created for the case scenario that we're going to go through. And you're also welcome to follow along by downloading that letter to your computer. And then there's also the results of the case review letter example that relates to this case scenario that you can also download. So that's the webinar control panel. A couple of users, so most people have said that they can hear us or they can hear me very well. There's still 2 users that are saying they're having issues. What I would ask you to do is just to log off and log back in, and then hopefully that will resolve your audio issues and you'll be able to hear us. So we're going to start off this webinar with a recap on IRCC's post-arrival assurance activities. And what we're going to focus on is the who, the what, the why, and the how. So who is conducting these activities, what activities they are conducting, why these activities are being conducted, and how they are being conducted. Starting off with the who, what, and the why. And if you read the sponsorship agreement, you'll note that the sponsorship agreement notes that both SARS and IRCC are responsible for monitoring the quality of financial and settlement support being provided to newcomers to ensure that both the sponsors and the newcomers are meeting their respective responsibilities. And the reason for this is because both IRCC and SARS share the same goal for sponsored refugees. And that shared goal is to have sponsored refugees settle and integrate well in their local community and to work towards self-sufficiency. And Section 5R of the sponsorship agreement states that SARS are responsible for monitoring their CGs and their co-sponsors, along with the refugees that they have sponsored. And the agreement further states that SARS are responsible for informing and working cooperatively with IRCC to resolve any post-arrival issues or problems that could lead to a sponsorship breakdown. And that's regardless of whether the issue or concerns relate to the sponsored refugees or the SARS CGs or co-sponsors. Section 6K of the sponsorship agreement states that IRCC is responsible for monitoring SARS along with their CGs and co-sponsors and the refugees that they have sponsored. And Section 6K further states that IRCC will ensure the results of the monitoring process are communicated with SARS and that they will work cooperatively with SARS to anticipate or resolve any problems or issues that may arise. In terms of who conducts these post-arrival assurance or monitoring activities, it's the IRCC's Resettlement Services Assurance Team, or RSAT for short. So RSAT, it's part of IRCC's Resettlement Operation Division's International Network. They are responsible for conducting post-arrival assurance activities. And RSAT's contact details will be available on screen at the end of the webinar. And they are also available on the RSDP website in the Key in Canada Operational Contacts handout, and I'll show you where to find that on our website later on in this webinar. And even though we are focusing on post-arrival monitoring when it comes to SARS and in relation to SARS, IRCC's post-arrival assurance activities also apply to groups of 5 and community sponsors as well. So RSAT, the team that's responsible for post-arrival assurance activities, also conducts these activities with regard to groups of 5 and community sponsors. In terms of how IRCC conducts post-arrival assurance activities, there's 3 types of activities that RSAT conducts. The first is reported cases. And reported cases is where RSAT responds to cases with potential concerns. And examples of some of those concerns may be inadequate financial and/or settlement support being provided, secondary migrations, or any disputes that may be occurring between the parties to the sponsorship. And these concerns are reported by partners and the community to RSAT. So RSAT receives information from a variety of internal partners as well as from the larger community, such as from social assistance workers, settlement workers at settlement agencies, or sponsors and even sponsored refugees themselves. And after a concern is reported to RSAT, RSAT provides the sponsor with the opportunity to work together by sharing information and documentation to demonstrate that the sponsorship requirements have been met. And RSAT will also attempt to speak to the sponsored refugees to evaluate their situation and to determine how much financial and non-financial support has been provided. And the important thing to remember is that even though a concern is reported to IRCC, it's not a determination that adequate support has not been provided. So just because RSAT receives a report of a potential concern from one of their internal or external partners, it doesn't mean that the sponsoring group is automatically considered to have been not providing sufficient support to the sponsored refugees. The sponsor is given the opportunity to demonstrate that adequate support has been provided, and if there is a shortcoming, the sponsor is given an opportunity to provide any outstanding support in order to avoid a sponsorship breakdown or even a potential sponsorship default. So that's the first activity that RSAT conducts, and that is in relation to reported cases. The second is proactive monitoring. And this is where RSAT conducts outreach to a random sample of PSR and BVR cases to confirm that adequate financial and settlement support is being provided by sponsors. And one of the reasons for this is so that RSAT and IRCC get a more complete picture of how well the PSR and BVR programs are working. So that's the second activity that RSAT conducts. And the third and final activity is reactive monitoring. This is where RSAT receives a number of case-specific follow-ups that are required, or they may even receive more serious allegations being reported to them. And if so, they'll take a sample of the sponsor's caseload and they'll assess them and interview them in order to analyze and review the concerns that were raised. So reactive monitoring is only conducted when there's reoccurring or serious reported concerns to ensure that groups are meeting their sponsorship responsibilities and commitments. And there is a IRCC produced resource available on the RSTP website that goes through these three types of post-arrival assurance activities that are conducted by RSAT in more detail. And the title of the document is the IRCC PSR Post-Arrival Assurance Activities Handout, and I'll show you where to find that handout along with the other IRCC produced handouts on our website later in this webinar. So we're now going to move on to the processing timeline for post-arrival assurance activities. And I'm just going to bring in Samia from IRCC, who will be going through this for us. So Samia, are you there?
I am.
Great.
So what you're, sure.
Sorry, go ahead. If you could just walk us through the post-arrival case review timeline.
Sure. So what you see on your screen before you is an illustration of the post-arrival case review processing timeline. This timeline represents what happens during a complete full case review. The timeline is flexible in that extensions can be requested and holidays also affect due dates. The case review process is initiated by a request for information letter, which is only issued when IRCC is unsure of whether refugees are being adequately supported, and more information is requested from sponsors to confirm the level of support being received. An RFI, in short, can be issued for a case through a proactive monitor, a reactive monitor, or if it is a reported case, as you will see later in this webinar. This timeline only starts when an RFI is issued. So for example, after interviewing a sponsored person during a reactive or proactive monitor, for example, IRCC would not initiate a full case review if the preliminary review indicates that minimum program requirements are being met in terms of the support that the person is receiving from their sponsor. So the first letter in this timeline, the RFI, requests information from the sponsor about the level of support provided to refugees. The information and documentation submitted by sponsors is then used by an officer to complete a fulsome review of the entire sponsorship. Sponsors at this point are provided 4 weeks to submit all requested documentation. It's important for sponsors to know that IRCC is very open to collaborating with sponsors either by phone or email to answer questions about program requirements and to provide suggestions of acceptable documentation. At the bottom of every RFI issued, as you will see later in this webinar, the issuing officer's name, telephone number, and email address is listed. Please feel free at any point throughout the process to contact the corresponding officer. For example, if you are wondering whether or not a document should be submitted or not, call or email the officer to ask. It is much more efficient than submitting documentation that is incomplete or does not demonstrate what the sponsor is trying to indicate to IRCC. Further, if you are waiting on a document that you would like to submit, for example, from a bank or an employer, ask the officer for an extension. Officers are also open to providing extensions when necessary. So once the documentation is received from the sponsors, the officer will review it as well as the information already on file that has been received or gathered from the sponsored person or persons. At this point, the officer assesses whether the minimum level of support has been provided. At the end of the officer's review, the officer issues sponsors with a results of case review letter. This letter indicates the officer's assessment of support provided to refugees. These findings include the Refugee Assistance Program, or RAP rate amounts, a summary of the support provided to date, and details about how the IRCC officer has calculated the support entitlement. This letter also outlines the areas where refugees have not received adequate support and requests that sponsors collaborate by addressing outstanding items or identifying any outstanding items that they wish to have reassessed. Sponsors are given 1 week to indicate whether they intend to comply with the program requirements and the outstanding items, or whether they will not comply, or they're also given an opportunity to request for a reassessment. Another week is given to update IRCC about the outstanding items, which may include providing documentation that shows that any outstanding payments have been provided. Once a reply to the results of case review letter is received, the officer reviews the documentation. If the officer does not receive a response to the results of case review, or the sponsors indicate they are not willing to address the outstanding issues, IRCC will then proceed with issuing a sponsorship breakdown because the sponsor has stated that they will not comply with program requirements, and therefore the sponsorship is no longer viable. Once the breakdown has been determined, the sponsorship cannot be restored. So it is really in the best interest of everyone that a case does not proceed to breakdown. If sufficient information exists that indicates that the responsibility of the breakdown rests with the sponsor, a procedural fairness letter is issued to this sponsor. This is really to give an opportunity to sponsors to respond with information that would show that the sponsor is not responsible for the breakdown. At this point, sponsors are provided with 4 weeks to submit information that would demonstrate that they are not responsible for the breakdown. Once this information or documentation is received, the officer will then again review. A default letter is issued if the sponsorship was broken down and the sponsor was found to be in default of their sponsorship obligations. So this entire process, as listed on the visual, takes about 4 months, but it's really important to note again that the timeline is flexible based on a number of factors. For example, particular case complications and complexities will really change this timeline. Or for example, if at the time results of case review stage, if the documentation submitted by the sponsor shows that the sponsored individuals are being supported at minimum level requirements, the case is then closed and does not proceed to breakdown. Or for example, at the same stage, if the sponsor responds with saying that they will comply and address any outstanding items indicated on the letter, the case is also closed. So just to summarize that, every case is really different, and this timeline is flexible to respond to those differences. So Sunny, back to you.
That's great. Thank you, Samia. So in terms of when you're looking at this timeline, you may be wondering, how far are we going down this timeline over the course of these 2 webinars? And the answer is we will be going right up until the sponsorship breakdown default stage over the course of the 2 webinars. But for today, we will be going up to the results of the case review letter. So you'll see what the request for information letter looks like later in this webinar and how it relates to the case scenario that we're going to go through. You'll also see and hear from us, our officers, to see what factors and what evidence and documentation they considered or that they would consider when or if they had to deal with this type of case scenario. And you'll also see the results of the case review letter. It's an example letter that's been drafted for the case scenario that we're going to go through. So we'll be going up to the results of the case review letter where the options are presented to the sponsors. And then next week, we'll be continuing down this timeline and looking into those 3 options in more detail, and also the sponsorship breakdown and default stage. But before we get into the scenario, we would like to highlight and bring your attention to a number of different resources that you may already be familiar with, but are available on the RSTP website to help you through the case review process, and also to help you both pre-arrival and post-arrival with having your CGs, your co-sponsors, and your SAR meet your financial and settlement responsibilities. So I'm just going to click out of this presentation for a minute, and I'm going to take you to the RSTP website. So hopefully everyone can see the RSTP website on your screen. And once you've selected your language, you'll be taken to this homepage. And what we've done in recent months is we've created a one-stop shop for all of the tools, resources, materials that relate to financial and settlement responsibilities, as well as the post-arrival assurance activities. And that one-stop hub or shop can be found under the Responsibilities tab, and it's the Overview of Sponsorship Responsibilities page. So what you'll see here is everything you need to help you through the case review process, as well as resources, tools, and information that just remind us of what a sponsor's financial and settlement responsibilities are. So there's a bit of information on the left-hand side here that just provides an overview and a reminder of the obligations of sponsors, of SARs, pre-arrival responsibilities and post-arrival responsibilities, as well as the financial and settlement responsibilities that SARs have, along with their CGs and co-sponsors, and groups of 5 and community sponsors. And then on the right-hand side over here, you'll see a number of different resources and tools that relate to sponsors' financial and settlement responsibilities, as well as the post-arrival assurance activity process. So you'll see over here, there's a number of important IRCC produced resources, including links to the FAQs on post-arrival financial support, which hopefully everyone is at least somewhat familiar with by this point. And there's also that PSR post-arrival assurance activities document that I referred to earlier. So if you want more detailed information about what is program assurance, why IRCC is conducting post-arrival assurance activities, if you want the contact information of the RSAT team, if you want information about the differences between reported cases, proactive monitoring, reactive monitoring, and some more detailed and thorough information about the procedures and processes that will be followed in each of those monitors, you can access this document from the Overview of Sponsorship Responsibilities tab. If you would like to review the case review process timeline that Samia just went through, there's also a link to it on this page where you can go through and see the various stages that occur as well as the timeline. And important for today is this document, the case review examples document, and we'll go through that in a moment. And that document basically provides sponsors with examples of documents that they can submit in response to a request for information letter from the RSAT team. There's also a link to a contact document that provides the contact information and a description of what all of the various IRCC departments involved in resettlement and refugee sponsorship do in Canada, as well as their contact information. So you can find the contact information of the Resettlement Services PSR team here, or NHQ. You may be more familiar with this team by that acronym. And you can also find the contact details of RSAT on this handout, because some of these emails are quite long, so it's a bit easier to just like copy and paste it into your email instead of trying to type the email address in manually. You can also find some information about the residency requirements. There's links to the RAP rates. There's also a link to the minimum financial support calculator tool, which you may already be familiar with, and also the declaration of funds and assets form. And we're going to be using some of these resources throughout the course of the rest of this webinar when we go into this case scenario. But what we've tried to do is all of these documents were already available and all of these tools were already available on the RSTP website. But what we've done is we've collated them onto one page, so you don't need to dig through various menus or various pages to find all of these different resources. You just go to the responsibilities page and then click on the overview of sponsorship responsibilities, and you'll have access to all of these tools and resources on the right-hand side via the sidebar. So a couple of things that we would like to go through because it relates directly to the case scenario we're going to cover in a moment before we get started with the case scenario. And the first is this IRCC produced handout on examples of documents that can be submitted by sponsors in response to the request for information letter. And you may be familiar with this document already because we've provided it and shared it in various formats through our different training sessions and webinars that we've delivered in the last year and a half or so. And it's also was shared at last year's SAR conference. So the first page just gives an introduction to why sponsors may need to submit documentation to IRCC, whose responsibility it is to provide this documentation, and just a reminder that it is the sponsor's responsibility to provide this documentation, and there's no onus or burden of proof on the refugee to provide documentation to show that they have received adequate financial support. There's a reminder of sponsors' financial and settlement responsibilities with links to the relevant resources and tools. And just a reminder that IRCC does not require copies of personal government documents in response to the request for information letter. They don't need copies of health cards, driver's licenses, medical records, passports, or any other personal government documentation. And if documentation with personal or private information is being submitted, such as bank statements or any other type of personal documents that has private information on there, that information, the private identifying information, can be redacted from the document before the copy of the document is sent to IRCC. And just a reminder, if sponsors have any concerns as to what documents may be acceptable proof of support, or they have any privacy concerns, to please reach out to the RSAT officer that is handling the case review for that particular case, and they'll be happy to speak to you and discuss any concerns or issues you may have. The second page provides examples of documents that can be submitted. So it's divided into various sections. The first section covers examples of documents that can be submitted by sponsors to prove that adequate financial support was being provided. And some of the examples of documents listed are copies of checks or copies of account statements showing transfers from the sponsor to the sponsored refugee, copies of receipts demonstrating rental payments or a copy of the lease agreement, information of any goods or services provided in kind, as well as any receipts that relate to those in-kind goods or services, any documentation to show, or copies of documentation to show that the refugee may be earning income, such as a copy of their T4 or a copy of pay stubs, if they haven't been working for a full tax year and they haven't received a T4 or filed their taxes to receive a notice of assessment. Any documentation to show that the refugees do have personal financial assets, and we'll show you an example of a document that can be submitted in a moment. Any copies of receipts that relate to temporary accommodation, copies of receipts or invoices or bills that relate to utility or communication installation payments. And the important thing to remember is that narrative information will be accepted on a case-by-case basis at the discretion of the officer. And it's not something that will be accepted in all cases, but it is at the discretion of the officer and may be accepted on a case-by-case basis in conjunction with other documents and other supporting evidence that is submitted. In terms of possible examples of documents that can be submitted by sponsors providing to demonstrate that they provided non-financial support or settlement support, there could be copies of confirmation of enrollment in language classes or a completion of a language assessment. There could be narrative information or other supporting documents to demonstrate attendance at workshops, trainings, orientation sessions, copies of a Canada Child Benefit application, or a copy of a document that shows that the sponsors have been receiving their CCB, a copy of an application or receipt for provincial healthcare coverage, or other documents to demonstrate that the refugees are covered by provincial healthcare, copies of documents to demonstrate access to a settlement agency or community resources, such as a letter indicating the needs assessment has been completed, or proof of an initial intake meeting or an appointment slip, copies of enrollment documents to show that the children are enrolled in daycare or childcare or school. And again, narrative information may be accepted on a case-by-case basis at the discretion of the officer. So those are examples of documents that can be submitted to show that adequate financial and non-financial support was being provided by the sponsoring group. But there's also additional documentation that is listed in this final column. And that includes copies of communication, so written communication such as emails and text messages, copies of communication between parties to the sponsorship, copies of updated settlement plans, and documents such as budget spreadsheets or QuickBook documents or Excel spreadsheets, statutory declarations or memorandum of understandings. They may be considered by the officer as part of the overall assessment, along with other information and supporting documents that have been submitted. However, because things such as budget spreadsheets, stat decks, affidavits, memorandums of understandings, they are non-verifiable in nature. These may not be considered to be definitive proof. So you can certainly submit these documents listed in this last column here under this heading, but please do ensure you are submitting copies of other documents that are also listed as possible examples of documentation that can be submitted to demonstrate that adequate financial and non-financial support was provided. If there are refugees that have personal financial assets with them on arrival, or there are refugees that obtain personal financial assets over the course of the sponsorship period, then sponsors can use this declaration of funds and assets form that is available on the IRCC website on that sponsorship responsibilities page just over here. And this can be used by sponsors when the refugees arrive in Canada or over the course of the sponsorship period. And it basically defines the rules that we're familiar with when it comes to the use of personal financial assets. It gives the personal asset exemption limits. And just as a reminder, refugees are able to have a certain amount of personal financial assets with them before it begins affecting the level of financial support being provided by the sponsoring group. And the maximum amount of allotted personal assets is based on family composition and family size, and is outlined on this document as well as in the FAQs on post-arrival financial support. So for example, if somebody is single, so a single newcomer arrives in Canada, let's say with $5,000, because the amount of personal financial assets they have is either below or equal to the maximum amount that they're permitted to have, it will not affect the level of financial support being provided by the sponsoring group. And just as a reminder, if there's any personal financial assets that the refugees have above the maximum permitted amount that's on screen in front of you, the first option that sponsors are supposed to give to the refugees is to apply the balance to their travel loan. So you provide the refugees with the option of applying anything that they have above the maximum permitted amount to their travel loan, and then if there's still money left over after they've paid off their travel loan, using the balance of the amount that was above the maximum permitted amount, then the sponsoring group may take into account only the portion of assets left over when it comes to whether they can reduce or eliminate financial support completely. And again, it's a 50% threshold for dollar deductions, and 150% threshold is where the sponsoring group may be able to reduce or eliminate financial support completely because the refugees are considered to be self-sufficient. But if you do want more information on how personal financial assets are to be considered, what the standards and threshold is for earned income and self-sufficiency, please do review the FAQs on post-arrival financial support, or the webinars we did with the IRCC last year, the recordings of which are available on the RSTB website, where we go through the FAQs in more detail and really break down each of the considerations and principles that need to be taken into account when it comes to personal financial assets, self-sufficiency, and earned income. But this is the form that can be used, and you'll see that this form was used by the sponsoring group in our case scenario, and it can be used on arrival when the refugees arrive in Canada, as well as over the course of the sponsorship period, and it's one of the examples of documents that can be submitted to demonstrate that the refugees do have personal financial assets. So going back to the presentation, we're going to come back and look at the minimum financial support calculator tool later in this webinar. But for now, we're going to go into the case scenario. So if everybody would like to download and open up the case scenario handout, that's available to download using the webinar control panel. And we'll just give you a few moments to do that, just so you can follow along with us. Although the case scenario will be presented on screen, but if you want to follow along, we'll just give you a few moments to download that case scenario using the control panel and open it up. So hopefully everyone's been able to do that. And this case scenario that we're going to go through is going to cover a reported case. So if you remember, IRCC's Resettlement Services Assurance Team, they have three types of activities that they conduct. They have reported cases, proactive monitoring, and then also the reactive monitoring. And what this is going to cover today is we will be looking at a reported case. So a reported case from the beginning, and we'll take it today up until the results of the case review letter is issued, and then next week we'll be looking to see the case through to see what would happen if the sponsoring group don't comply and it goes to the breakdown and default stage. So this is the scenario we're working through today. So it's a family of four, a couple and two children aged 8 and 12, and this family arrived in Canada under the PSL program on September 1st, 2019. Shortly after the family have arrived in Canada, IRCC is notified by Ontario Works that the family have applied for social assistance. An officer from ARSAT contacts the family with the assistance of an interpreter, and they gather the following information from the call. The ARSAT officer learns that the family arrived in Canada with 5,000 Canadian dollars worth of personal financial assets. Upon arrival in Canada, the family stayed in temporary accommodation for 1 week, and the sponsoring group paid for the temporary accommodation. The sponsoring group helped the family secure permanent accommodation in Etobicoke, so within the Greater Toronto area, and the accommodation is a 2-bedroom apartment that costs $1,800 per month. The family were given a check for $5,000 by the sponsoring group when they moved into their apartment, and the group explained that this money was intended to help the family buy furniture, regular and winter clothing, linens, household items, and supplies. The sponsoring group provides the family with $1,500 a month to cover the cost of their living expenses, and the sponsoring group also helped the family apply for the Canada Child Benefit, and the family are receiving $933.66 per month from the CRA for the Canada Child Benefit. The couple, so the parents, they're attending language classes full-time and they are not working. Both of the children are enrolled and they're attending elementary school. The family have received their health cards, they've received their PR cards, and they are registered with a nearby family doctor. The family state that they applied for social assistance to supplement the financial support they were receiving from sponsors, as they do not have enough money to pay their monthly expenses. The family also state that both of their children are currently sharing a bed at the moment until they can save enough money to buy another bed so each child can have their own bed. Based on the above information received from the family, the RSAT officer is concerned about the level of financial support that is being provided by the sponsoring group to the family and the level of financial support the family is receiving. And the RSAT officer connects them with a local settlement agency to assist them with accessing food banks or other services that may be required. So that's the scenario that we're going to go through today. And this is what we will be seeing through up until the results of case review letter are issued today. And next week, we'll see it through to the breakdown and default stage. So once the RSAT officer receives that information from the refugee family, what they will do, as you saw on the timeline, is they will send a request for information letter to the sponsoring group. And the request for information letter is intended to gain a better understanding of the level of support that is being provided by the sponsoring group to the newcomer family. And the sponsoring group is provided with 30 days, 30 calendar days to respond to the request for information letter with the requested information and documents. And we're going to go through an example of a letter that would have been sent by the RSAT officer in this case to the sponsoring group in a moment. And just a reminder that sponsoring groups are encouraged to contact the RSAT officer that issued the letter if they have any questions about the issues or concerns raised, or if they have any questions about the types of documents they can submit in response to the request for information letter. And they're also encouraged to contact the issuing officer if they need extra time or if there are any concerns with meeting the 30-day deadline. And the contact information of the RSAT officer that issues the letter will always be at the bottom of the letter. And we'll see that on the example in a moment. So I'm just going to exit out of this presentation and pull up the request for information letter that would have been sent by the RSAT officer, in this case, to the sponsoring group. So I'm just going to zoom in slightly. So hopefully everyone is able to see this. And it's also available to download using the webinar control panel. And you can also follow along by printing it out or opening it up on your computer. So this is the request for information letter that would have been sent. So at the top, it obviously has the date, it has the file number for the sponsorship, as well as the names of the refugees in the family. So if you remember, it's a family of 4, a couple and 2 children aged 8 and 12. So the letter starts off with an introduction and then goes into a list of documents that sponsoring groups may submit in response to the request for information letter. And what the RSAT officer will do is they will indicate exactly which documents they want the sponsoring group to submit in response to the request for information letter. So even though there is this quite long list of documents or types of documents, even though there's quite a long list of financial and settlement responsibilities that the RSAT officer is requesting information in response to, you don't need to submit everything or documents that shows that each settlement or financial responsibility was provided by the sponsoring group. The sponsoring group only needs to submit documents that relate to the concerns raised by the refugee family and reported to the RSAT officer. So if you remember in this scenario, there weren't any settlement concerns. The refugees had their PR card, the family, the adults are enrolled in English language classes, the whole family is enrolled with a local doctor, the children are enrolled and are attending elementary school. So there's no settlement concerns that the RSAT officer has in this case. The only concerns that they have relate to the financial support being provided by the sponsoring group and the level of financial support being received by the refugee family. So if you look through this list, the RSAT officer has only indicated that they need supporting documentation to demonstrate that financial support has been provided. So in this case, they've requested documentation to show that startup support, both monetary and in-kind support, was provided. They requested documentation to show that monthly income financial support was provided, any budget calculations that may have been done, any examples of documents to show that whether any deductions were done on the basis of assets or earnings, documentation to show that adequate shelter was provided, that's both permanent and temporary shelter, and a copy of the settlement plan for this family. So if you see all of these things in the middle here, they relate to settlement support. And that's not being requested in this case because the RSAT officer does not have any concerns about the level of settlement support or the quality of the settlement support being provided by the sponsoring group. So just remember that you don't need to provide documentation that shows that the sponsoring group was providing all of these supports, unless of course they're all selected and checked off by the RSAT officer. You just need to provide documentation to show that support was being provided for the financial and settlement support items that have been checked off by the RSAT officer. So the RSAT officer has indicated that they need supporting documentation to show that adequate financial support was being provided. And there's just a reminder at the bottom of the first page that the deadline to respond to the request for information letter is within 30 days. So the letter was issued on December 10th, 2019, and the sponsoring group has until January 10th, 2020 to respond to the request for information letter. Moving on to page 2 of the letter, there's a link to the examples of documentation resource that we just looked at on the RSTP website. So if you do have questions or you're not sure what types of documents you can submit in response to this request for information letter, you can review that document that is linked to in the letter. Or if you would like some further guidance from the RSAT officer, you can contact the RSAT officer, and I'll show you where the RSAT officer's contact details would be on this letter in a moment. There's also some information about how the documents and the information that the RSAT officer will receive will be assessed. So a reminder that the amount of support that sponsors are expected to provide is based on standards outlined in the sponsorship undertaking, as well as the sponsorship agreement in the context of SARS, and the level of financial support to be provided must be at least be equivalent to the prevailing RAP rates in the community of settlement when the refugees arrive in Canada. And then the letter goes into some reminders of the standards of support that are to be provided by a sponsoring group to a refugee or a refugee family. So just these are all things we already know, that startup support is required in all situations. It can be a combination of financial items or payments as well as in-kind items, and you cannot provide in-kind startup items or the monthly income financial support fully in kind, and any in-kind items such as furniture or anything else belong to the sponsored individual once they be provided by the sponsoring group. A reminder that an allowance of $150 per child must be given to anyone aged between 4 and 21 as to cover the school startup costs, and that school startup allowance may need to be issued twice for families who arrive between September 1st and May 31st because the sponsorship period covers 2 academic years, and that the shelter amount can only be provided fully in kind if the shelter is provided to the sponsored individual without cost, and a reminder that sponsors may need to provide the additional $200 housing supplement if actual shelter costs, including the cost of utilities, exceeds the shelter allowance. And there's also a reminder that the basic needs allowance, which covers food and incidentals, can only be reduced by a maximum of 50% if the refugee is residing with a party to the sponsorship. So in the context of sponsorship agreement holders, that means a co-sponsor that was listed on the undertaking. And there's a couple of other principles from the FAQs on post-arrival financial support that we're already familiar with and we have already covered in previous webinars. And then the letter provides some information about what will happen during the case review. So just a reminder that the sponsoring group must continue providing financial and non-financial support during the case review process, and they must continue to do so either until the end of the sponsorship period or until IRCC declares a sponsorship breakdown. And then it goes on into a couple of the things. If the sponsoring group is not able to carry on providing financial and settlement support, and it also discusses the next steps in the case review process. And then finally, at the bottom here will be the name and contact information of the ARSAT officer that is responsible for this case review and also issued the letter. There's also an annex attached to the letter, and that annex just provides a definition of sponsorship breakdown and default, which is the definition we're all familiar with, and we'll cover that in more detail in next week's webinar. So that's the request for information letter. So this would have been the letter that would have been issued to the sponsoring group in this case, and the ARSAT officer is looking for documentation to show that financial support was being provided to the sponsoring group. So once the request for information letter is issued, the case then moves on to stage 2. And this is where the sponsoring group responds to the request for information letter, and they submit documents and information in response to the request for information letter. And in this case, the sponsoring group responds to the ARSAT officer within the 30-day deadline and submits the following information and evidence. They submit a narrative statement from the sponsoring group that includes some information to supplement the documents submitted and also gives a short explanation about the sponsorship experience so far. A copy of the settlement plan form that was requested was updated post-arrival by the sponsoring group, and that's the copy of the settlement plan that they submit. And the updated settlement plan shows that there was a change in housing arrangement. So initially, the newcomer family was originally supposed to stay with relatives in Mississauga for the duration of the sponsorship period, but that accommodation was no longer suitable as there was not sufficient space for the newcomer family because the relatives that owned that property had several newborn children by the time the family arrived in Canada, and there wasn't sufficient accommodation within that house to accommodate them. So the settlement plan was updated by the sponsoring group to reflect the changes in the housing arrangements. And if you remember, the family were given an apartment in Etobicoke, and the cost of rent for that 2-bedroom apartment was $1,800 per month. And the sponsoring group submit a copy of the lease agreement for that apartment in Etobicoke that shows that the sponsors have signed as guarantors and the monthly rent is $1,800 per month. A copy of a check for $1,000 that was used as a security deposit for the apartment is also submitted to the ARSAT officer, and copies of receipts showing a 6-night stay at the Days Inn in Mississauga upon the newcomer family arriving in Canada is also submitted. So if you remember in this scenario, the family initially stayed in temporary accommodation 6 nights before they transitioned to that permanent accommodation in Etobicoke. The sponsoring group also submit a copy of a check for $5,000 issued to the newcomer family, intended to cover startup costs, and they also submit copies of bank statements from the sponsoring group showing that $1,500 per month was electronically transferred to the sponsored refugee, to the head of the newcomer family in the first week of every month. And they also submit a signed copy of the Declaration of Funds and Assets form that we looked into earlier that indicates that the family had $5,000 in personal financial assets on arrival in Canada. And the narrative information that was also submitted states that the sponsoring group reduced the financial support provided to the newcomer family on account of these assets by $400 per month. So that's stage two. At stage two, the sponsoring group responds to the request for information letter and they submit the information and copies of the supporting documents that were requested by the RSAT officer. This case now goes into stage three, and this is where the RSAT officer reviews all of the information and documentation they've received and they make their findings. And this stage can take up to approximately 14 days. And what will happen once the RSAT officer has reviewed all the supporting documents, they will make the decision and they will draft and send their findings to the sponsoring group in the results of the case review letter. And the results of the case review letter will be issued by the RSAT officer to the sponsoring group. And the results of the case review letter provides the sponsoring group with information and the details of the officer's findings, but also with a 7-day deadline to indicate their willingness to comply with the financial or non-financial requirements and outstanding items noted in the letter. And if the sponsoring group agrees to comply with the outstanding items in the request, in the results of the case review letter, an additional 7 days is provided to the sponsoring group to forward all outstanding funds to the newcomers and forward copies of the outstanding items to RSAT. So I'm just going to pass over to Matthew from IRCC, who will be going through the results of case review letter for this case scenario. So I'm going to pull it up on screen, and you're also welcome to follow with the version that's available to download. And Matthew, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Thank you, Sunit. So as Sunit was saying, anytime that a request for information letter is sent to a sponsoring group, what will follow is the results of case review letter. The one that we're going to be reviewing today is when it appears that the minimum sponsorship requirements have not been met. So if we do our assessment and we do see that it looks like sponsorship requirements were being maintained throughout the sponsorship, there would be a shortened version of this letter that would be sent to the sponsoring group just to kind of close the loop and just let them know the results of our findings were positive. And really what this letter is for is it explains our assessment and gives you an opportunity to respond to the preliminary results of the review. So if everyone has the letter pulled up, we'll go through the letter together, and I'll try to explain a little bit the thought process that goes behind some of our decisions. So starting on page 1, part A, case details. This section contains information about everything that was considered by the officer when reviewing if the sponsorship requirements were being maintained throughout the sponsorship period. Okay, so in this particular case, based on the information received or on file, the following factors have been considered. So firstly, the principal applicant and family members arrived in Toronto on September 1st, 2019. Receipts provided by the sponsorship group indicate that the family was provided with in-kind temporary housing for 6 days upon arrival and later moved to permanent housing in Etobicoke. So one thing to note, if they were originally supposed supposed to settle in Toronto and they're now in Etobicoke. That would not be considered a secondary migration, as it is pretty close proximity, about within 20 minutes or so. So we would not consider that a secondary migration, and we would have no issues with that. If the sponsorship group did find it would be beneficial to have somebody in Etobicoke for the family, they could appoint representatives, or they could explore other options in that community as well. A lease agreement was submitted that confirms monthly rental amount of $1,800. Shelter allowance plus national housing supplement have therefore been included from the minimum financial support table below. So we'll go through the support table once we get to that on page number 3, I believe. The family reported that they have received their provincial health cards and are registered with a family doctor in their community. They also reported that they are receiving the Canada Child Benefit, or CCB. They also reported that they have all received their PR cards. Both adults have registered for language classes, and all the children are enrolled in school. And IRCC connected the family with a settlement agency in their community to assist with some of the financial and non-financial support that might be resourceful to help the family to adjust to life in Canada. Flipping over to page 2, the sponsorship group submitted proof of a $5,000 check issued to the PA on September 7, 2019. According to both the PA and the sponsorship group, this money was intended for startup support. This amount has been reduced from the startup section in the minimum financial support table below. Sponsorship group submitted copies of electronic transfers in the amount of $1,500 in the first week of each month from September to December 2019. This amount has also been reduced from the corresponding month in the minimum financial support table below. A signed declaration of funds and assets on arrival of privately sponsored refugees by the PA was submitted. The PA arrived to Canada with an amount of money below the personal exemption limit. Therefore, this has not been taken into account when calculating financial support. So in this case, the family is allowed up to $12,500 of personal assets. So that is why that amount that they came to Canada with would not be considered towards any deductions. We move into Part B. Part B is where we would state any outstanding items, so both from a non-financial and a financial perspective. So number 2, we ask that you take action on the following non-financial outstanding items. So 2 things that are stated here. 1 is assist the family with obtaining any additional or missing household items or furniture. So one thing that Sanit did talk about was how the 2 children were sharing a bed and that they were looking to purchase another bed, just waiting for some of that money. So that could probably be tied back to the financial gap that we might have in the sponsorship. But the sponsors are encouraged to reach out to the family if it's not already done by this point, and just help them with getting any additional items that they might need or that they're missing. The sponsorship group should continue to provide non-financial support to the sponsored persons for the remainder of the sponsorship period. Number 3, we ask that you take action on the following financial outstanding items. So what's noted in there is to provide any outstanding financial support as outlined in the chart below, and forward documentation to IRCC to demonstrate completion by the due date listed below. So we'll get into the due date listed below. It's 14 days to provide any of that information to IRCC from the date of the date that the letter was issued. Provide at the minimum monthly support at Resettlement Assistance Program, or RAP rates, for the remainder of your commitment of the sponsorship period. Please ensure that any future deductions follow the RAP program. In this case, it's a little bit more of a particular case since we have had a RAP rate increase in November. So please note that RAP rates have been updated as of November 1st, 2019 in certain provinces. Please refer to rsdp.ca and the prevailing RAP rates in the community of settlement for updated rates. So we also do include some links to resources in our letters, so you'll see them some underlined, the RAP rates. Later on, you'll see the undertaking, the FAQs, the minimum financial support calculator. So all of those are available, And again, if you have any additional questions at any point, you could reach out to the officer who might be able to help you access some of these additional resources available to you. So we'll see how that change in RAP rates affected this case a little bit as we move on through this case. Number 4, how financial support requirements are calculated. So this section is really just to kind of break down the financial aspect of this and explain to you how we came to our decision. So if we go to point 2, so the minimum financial support calculator developed by RSTP can provide sponsorship groups with an estimate of post-arrival sponsorship costs. You can also refer to the FAQs on post-arrival financial support for additional information. So one thing I want to note is that officers do use the calculator during their review. So if sponsors are using the minimum financial support calculator when trying to determine the cost of the sponsorship, there should be no major surprises, and those amounts should match to our assessment. So in this case, based on the rates for a family of 4, the minimum startup support is calculated to be as follows. So $480 for staple allowance, $1,250 for basic clothing allowance, $600 for winter clothing allowance, $750 for basic household needs, $3,185 for furniture allowance, $320 for linens, $75 for utility installation, and in this case, you would have a $300 school startup allowance for a total of $6,960. Based on the rates for a family of 4 residing in Etobicoke, Ontario, minimum monthly financial support is calculated to be the following. So $494 basic needs, $756 shelter allowance, $200 national housing supplement, $30 communication allowance, and $302.30 for a transportation allowance for a total of $1,782.30. So one thing to be reminded when we are talking about the startup amount that's listed there, so that is the total cost before any applicable deductions. Same thing for the monthly cost. We're just trying to give an idea of where we started our assessment. This is the amount, and then we applied any deductions in Part A as I was saying we were going through it. The section number 5, the minimum financial support table, is where we're going to put the total amounts, and then we're going to remove any deductions that we stated in Part A of the letter. So moving on to point number 5, minimum financial support table. Before starting this, I want to just apologize. There is a small correction that should be made here. So you'll see for the month of September and October that the RAP entitlement in column A is $1,762.30. There is then an increase as of November 1st, as we just discussed, and the amount goes up by $20 a month to $1,782.30. If you scroll over to column number E, you will notice that the adjusted payment is $1,782.30 for all 4 months. That should be corrected to being $1,762.30 for the month of September and October only. So the increase only took part in November, so that amount would be $1,782 as of those dates, $1,782.30. So now to go through the whole table, starting with the startup. So the RAP entitlement for this, as we just stated, was $6,960. The net, so column B, column C, column D, column E are all non-applicable in the startup category. We will go through them in the monthly categories. So the RAP entitlement was $6,960. Sponsor support issued was $5,000. So that was a check that was issued that both the PA and the sponsoring group said were for startup. We had proof of the check, so we can apply that as sponsor support. Which leaves a amount owing of $1,960. So $5,000 was not quite enough to be meeting sponsorship requirements in this case. As we're looking through the monthly financial supports, so the RAP entitlement for September was $1,762.30. The net earnings, so this is where we would put any employment income. In this case, there was no employment income. Column number C is the earnings exemption based on full RAP rates. So that is the amount of money that the family is allowed to earn before any deductions would be made to their RAP entitlement. So in this case, it is 50% of the RAP entitlement, or $891.15. The deductible would be if there was any earned income, so it'd be column B, so your net earnings minus your earnings exemption based on full RAP rates. In this situation, is zero. And as I said, the adjusted payment there should be $1,762.30. So there are e-transfers that highlight a monthly transfer of $1,500 in the first week of every month. So that was removed, or it was considered as sponsor support issued. Once again, that's just a little bit off the RAP rates of $1,762.30. So that leaves a balance of $362.30 for the month of September and October, and a balance of $382.30 for November and December. What that leaves at the end of the 4 months and startup is a total balance owing of $3,449.20. So moving into section number 6, next steps. So at the bottom of the page, you will see that there is a deadline included. So by January 27th, which will be 7 calendar days after the issuance of the letter, please complete and return the bottom portion of this letter and indicate whether or not you are willing to comply with the financial and non-financial requirements, as well as the outstanding items noted in this letter. So if we go back, the outstanding items are listed on page number 2, sections 2 and 3, and then in the minimum financial support table, number 5, you will see the total amount owing to the family. Over to page 4 now, it states, if you agree to comply and financial support is currently in arrears, please forward all outstanding funds to the sponsored individuals within 14 calendar days by February 3rd, 2020. Please forward copies of outstanding items to IRCC within the same timeline. So this would be a 2-step process. If you do agree to comply, that would need to be returned to IRCC within 7 calendar days. And then you would have an additional 7 days to provide proof to IRCC of the outstanding funds or the outstanding items being issued to the family. So in this case, IRCC would need to see proof of payment for $3,449.20 within 14 calendar days. If you have new information or supporting documentation that may change the results of this case review, please check the appropriate box below and return the completed acknowledgement portion of this letter along with new information or documentation within 7 calendar days or by January 27, 2020. So what this refers to is if you did have some more documentation that you are looking to submit, so you forgot to submit some documentation, or you just realize that there's something that could really help explain the supports that were provided during this sponsorship, you can ask for a reassessment. So we'll go through that in a second. The reassessment needs to be asked for within 7 calendar days. And during those 7 calendar days, you must also provide IRCC with any type of new information that should be considered in the reassessment. So if this information or documentation changes the results of the review, but items remain outstanding, we will send you a reassessment letter. if that information or documentation changes the results of the review and it's deemed that you are meeting sponsorship requirements, you would receive a shortened version, like I was saying earlier, just to say that you are meeting sponsorship requirements and the case would be closed. IRCC will begin sponsorship breakdown procedures if by the deadline above you do not indicate that you are willing to comply. So if you indicate that you are not willing to comply, or do not send us a response, or do not provide documentation of payment of outstanding funds. So it is important that you remember that second deadline. If you do say that you are going to comply with outstanding items, we do need to see proof of those, proof of that compliance in 14 days from the issuance of the letter. Information about sponsorship breakdown and sponsorship default is provided in the annex below. So on the last page, there is an annex. We're not going to go through it today. We will go through it on the next webinar where we talk about sponsorship breakdowns and sponsorship defaults. Again, we've said it a few times now, but the officer's name and contact information, so a direct phone number, will be available at the bottom of the letter. It is encouraged to contact officers with any questions. So we know at the results of case review letter, there's a lot of information that's being put in this letter. So you're encouraged to reach out to the officer if there's anything that you don't understand or you want clarification on, or if you're a little unclear on next steps, please reach out and we'll definitely be happy to get back to you. You can also reach out to us if you do need an extension, so just provide us with a reason and that will be considered by the officer. So depending on what the reason is, we are open to providing extensions if required. And just a reminder that sponsors must continue supporting families while sponsorship review is ongoing. So we talked about the process sometimes being a little bit of a long process, but you are required to continue supporting that family during that process. Finally, if we go to page number 5, the acknowledgement page, this is the page where you will basically say if you are willing to comply with the financial and non-financial requirements as well as any outstanding items. You can also ask for a reassessment, or you can say that you do not want to comply with the financial and non-financial requirements. So please check the appropriate box below to indicate that the sponsoring group is willing to ensure that support provided will meet or exceed program requirements for the remainder of the sponsorship period and will comply with any outstanding items noted within. Again, if you indicate compliance and are submitting new documentation along with this acknowledgement, please note that the original due date of 7 calendar days applies. So if you are checking off that second box for a reassessment, you do only get 7 days to provide us with that answer and submit new documentation with that of what should be considered for a reassessment. If you are submitting new documentation to request a reassessment, please note that the case will be assessed again in full and all additional months that have passed since the original due date of the request for information letter will be reviewed. So if a new month has elapsed in full, it will be included in the review. So for example, in this case, if we did get to February, we might review the month of January as well during our reassessment of that case. So that would not be the case in this one because it's January 20th. But if a whole month has elapsed since and we're into a new calendar month, we would review that previous month as well. We encourage all parties to the sponsorship to sign. So if there are multiple parties to the sponsorship, they will all be listed on the results of case review letter. Failure of any party to sign and acknowledge may lead to default. And then you would just sign one of the 3 options below, and you would provide that back to IRCC within the deadline. And that is a quick review of the results of case review letter.
Thank you, Matthew. So we're just going to switch back to the presentation. So like I said when we started this webinar, we're going to stop this case scenario at this stage, where the sponsoring group is given the three options in the results of case review letter to either comply with the financial and non-financial requirements outlined in the letter, as well as to comply with any outstanding items noted within the letter, or they take the second option, or they're given the second option of acknowledging the financial and non-financial requirements noted in the letter, but they're submitting new documentation to request a reassessment that may affect the outstanding items. And the third option is where they will not comply with the financial and non-financial requirements, as well as the outstanding items noted within. So we're going to pick this up next week on Monday, January 20th, and we'll look to see what route this sponsoring group takes and what would happen if they decided to not comply, and how a sponsorship breakdown and default will be processed by IRCC. So hopefully that was somewhat helpful in giving everyone an understanding of what the letters look like if you haven't seen one of these already, as well as what the overall case review timeline looks like and what the overall process looks like. Before we end today's webinar and try and do some Q&A, we're going to give you a visual representation of what level of financial support the family should have been receiving. So if you remember, Matthew mentioned the RAP rates increased for certain provinces on November 1st, 2019, and Ontario was one of those provinces. So the amount of financial support changed as of November 1st, 2019, but because the family arrived September 1st, 2019, this is what they would have been entitled to on arrival. So the family received $5,000 for startup costs, and they received $1,500 per month for the monthly income support component. For the startup costs, they should have received $6,960 before in-kind deductions. And for the monthly income support component, they should have received $1,762.30 per month. So they would have received that amount, the $1,762.30, for 2 months, for September and October. And then from November 1st, 2019 onwards, because the RAP rates for Ontario increased, they would have been entitled to receive $1,782.30 per month. And we're just going to run this scenario through the financial support calculator, just as a reminder of how the tool works. And as Matthew mentioned, this calculator tool is used by IRCC and RSAT officers to determine the amount of financial support that sponsored refugees are entitled to. So if you are using the minimum financial support calculator tool, there should be no discrepancies between the amount of financial support being provided and the amount that the family are entitled to. So in terms of where you can find this, first of all, 2 ways. You can go to the main page of the RSTP website, and it's available as a freestanding item under the responsibilities tab over here. So you can either click on it there, or you can find it on the one-stop shop we have for everything related to assurance activities and post-arrival financial and settlement support standards. So you can find it under the assurance tools section just over here. Once the calculator is open, you're taken to this splash page where you have to enter some information in about the family that's being sponsored, or the individual that's being sponsored. So if you remember, in our scenario, we had a family of 4, so we would select 4, and they were living in Toronto, Ontario, or they were living in Etobicoke and Mississauga, which is in the Greater Toronto area. So we'll leave that as Toronto for now. And the reason why you need to specify the community of settlement is because it will automatically pull, the calculator will automatically pull figures for the transportation allowance from the provincial or municipal transportation authority's website. So because this family are living within Etobicoke, which is in the GTA, the figures pulled for this family will be for GTA transit rates. So we then need to specify the composition of adults. Are they senior, not senior. In this case, they're a couple and they're not seniors. And again, the reason why we need to specify the composition of the couple, whether they're seniors or not seniors, is because the family may be entitled to certain senior rates depending on the province they're in. So we've selected that they're a couple consisting of no seniors, and then we then need to specify the ages of the children. So the ages of the children are 12 and 8. Let's say, for example, you forget to include, for whatever reason, the number of children in the family size. So let's say you're just considering the couple, it slipped your mind that there's 2 children in the family, you come to this section and you indicate that there are 2 children. The family size at the top here will automatically change to 4. So if it's just slipped your mind and you forget to include the children in this initial family size calculation, when you come to the children's section and you indicate that there are children, the family size will change automatically. So we have the ages of our children, 12 and 8. You then need to indicate whether there's a pregnant family member or a newborn child in the family. And again, the reason for that, as we know, is because pregnant family members or newborn children are entitled to certain allowances under RAP. And you also need to indicate whether there is a family member with a special dietary need. And again, the reason for this is because refugees with a special dietary allowance are entitled to $75 a month, provided they're able to provide a doctor's or a nurse's note indicating that they do have a medical condition that requires a specialized diet. But in this scenario, there's no pregnant family members and nobody has any specialized dietary needs as a result of a medical condition. You can also indicate whether the family has any income, because this calculator will do the earned income calculation for you. It will automatically calculate the 50% threshold, the 150% threshold, and let sponsors know what deductions they can do on the basis of earned income. So you would need to indicate the monthly net income for the whole family in this section, but because the family are not earning at the moment, they're both in full-time language classes, that is 0. You then click the calculate button, and then this calculator will do the calculation for you. And as you see here, this family is entitled to $6,960 for startup costs before in-kind deductions, and the calculator is using the post-November 1st, 2019 rates. So it's showing that the family would receive $1,782.30 as of November 1st, 2019 onwards. If there's any in-kind deductions that are being done, and this is now kind of stepping outside the scenario that we have, but let's say hypothetically in-kind deductions are being done for the linens allowance. And sponsors have the option of either entering in the value amount of the item or good or service being provided in kind, or the percentage amount using the percentage figures in Appendix A of the IMM 5413 guide. But again, as a reminder, in-kind deductions cannot be valued for more than their actual value amount. So let's say this family or the sponsoring group bought very fancy linens, and they're saying to you, it cost us $800 for linens. They can't do in-kind deductions of $800 for linens because that not only exceeds the maximum permitted percentage amount, it's also, it's basically above the permitted percentage amount, and you'll receive a warning here saying a maximum of 100% can be done for linens provided in kind. So even though the actual value is higher than the maximum percentage amount, you have to go with the maximum because that's the maximum permitted percentage amount. So they can only do $320 for in-kind deductions, even though these linens are valued by the sponsoring group as at $800. So for example, for the furniture allowance, they can go up to 70%, and the percentage amounts are listed next to each category. Let's say the value of the furniture provided is $100. So because the value amount is lower than the maximum permitted percentage amount of the $70, the sponsoring group would go with the actual value amount of the furniture, which means that the family are still entitled to receive $3,085. So you'll receive the amount before in-kind deductions are applied in the first column. You'll see the percentage and dollar amount of the goods or services being provided in kind, and then the adjusted amount taking into account the percentage or value amount of the good or service being provided in kind. And then the final amount, it will show you the amount before in-kind deductions for each of the two categories, as well as the final amount after in-kind deductions. So that's just a very quick walkthrough of the financial support calculator. And like Matthew mentioned, if you're using this calculator, your figures should match up with the figures that would be provided by RSAT in the results of the case review letter. So we're now going to move on to Q&A, and we'll try and answer as many questions as possible. But like I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, there is a technical issue where IRCC is not able to view the questions. So if you don't have your question answered during this live Q&A segment, you will receive a written response to your question with links to the appropriate resources and tools. And those responses that are provided in writing will be sent to all attendees and everyone that is on this webinar today. In the meantime, while we're going through the questions, I'm going to put some contact information up on the screen. So at the top, you have IRCC's RSAT's email address, so the email address for the Resettlement Services Assurance team. Like I said, it is very long. It's often easier to just find that key contacts handout document on the RSTP website, or one of the other documents on the RSTP website that has the email listed, and just copy and paste it into your email. And then there's also below that information about where you can find the contact details of RSTP trainers across the country. So rstp.ca/contact us, you can find the details of your local RSTP trainer. So I'm just going to go off the air for a couple of minutes, and I'm just going to go through the questions to see which ones can be answered today live, and then questions that are not answered today, like I said, written responses will be sent to everybody on this webinar at a later date. So I'm going to go off the air for a couple of minutes, and I'll be back on there shortly. Okay, so there are a couple of questions that we can answer today. And Matthew and Samia, I may direct some of the more simpler questions to you that may be able to be answered today. First question is about a webinar on December 10th on how to prepare and submit a successful application package. Somebody was wondering if they could get a copy of that presentation. A recording of that webinar is available on the RSTP website. If you go to the RSTP website, click on resources, past webinars, and you'll be able to view a copy of that webinar. And it's also part of our monthly webinar series that we repeat each month. So we'll be doing it at some point in January, and it will continue up until the end of the fiscal year. Another question relating to the presentation for this webinar, a couple of people are asking, will the presentation be made available after the webinar? The presentation itself will not be made available, but a recording of the presentation will be made available. So a recording will be uploaded to the RSTP website, like we have done for the other webinars we have done for SARS, and the webinar coming up, part 2 of this webinar on Monday, will also be recorded, and that will also be uploaded to the RSTP website as well. I know there's a couple of comments from a couple of attendees that did have issues hearing us, so you'll be able to go back once those recordings are available and review the webinar or the parts that weren't quite so clear because of the audio issues. And we'll let everyone know via the SAR list and the RSTP bulletin when recordings of both of the webinars happening this week and next week are available for viewing on the RSTP website. So Matthew and Samia, there's just a quick question about the request for information letter. Is the request for information letter only sent to the CGs and co-sponsors, or is the SAR also sent a copy?
So I can take that one. A little bit of echo there. So it would be sent to all parties of the sponsorship. So it'd be sent to the SAW as well in that case.
Thank you. And there's a couple of other questions which may need a bit more time for an answer. So there's a couple of questions about proactive monitoring and is it currently on hold and when it's expected to begin again. We will provide written responses to those questions to all attendees at some point in the coming weeks after both of these webinars. So there's a question on earnings, so earned income. Please confirm that net earnings are earnings after deductions. This is the amount that the employee takes home in a check. So yes, the answer is yes. When it comes to earned income, IRCC is looking at the net employment income, and deductions can only begin after net employment income becomes higher than 50% of the monthly financial support being received by the sponsoring group. That's when deductions can begin dollar for dollar for each dollar earned above the 50% threshold, but it is net employment income. It's not gross, it's net income when it comes to calculating the 50% and the 150% threshold. There's a couple more questions about whether the webinar will be recorded. Yes, it is being recorded, and a recording will be made available on the IRCC website. And so there's a couple of other questions about, is a newcomer not obligated to provide any supporting documentation? I'm not sure if we can take that one now, Matt.
Yes, I could. So there is something in the FAQs about that. So I'd rather just give the exact wording of that and provide that afterwards if that's okay. But they are not required to provide any documentation. So let me just get back to you with a little more detail on that. But no, it is not a requirement that they provide that documentation. Okay,
great. Thank you, Matt. So we will follow up in writing at a later date, and all attendees will receive that response. So that's all of the questions that have come in. And like I said, if you didn't receive a response to your question, we have been collating them. We just want to make sure that some of the more in-depth questions, we provide you with the most in-depth information and the appropriate information with links to the relevant tools and resources. And also because IRCC are not able to view the questions because of the technical issue, it would be easier for them to view the question in writing before they respond to it. So if your question was not answered today, we will send a response by email to all attendees, and we'll hope to send that response once both of these webinars in this series have been delivered and conducted. So just a reminder that we will be seeing this case scenario through to a sponsorship breakdown and default stage next week. And that webinar will be taking place on Monday, January 20th, 2020 at 1 p.m. Eastern. Hopefully we won't have the technical issues that we have today, and we're able to do a live Q&A. And we hope to see as many of you there as possible. And there will be some further training and information coming out both in person and online for SARs as well as their CGs and co-sponsors. So just keep an eye out on the SAR list for that, as well as on the RSTP bulletin. So thank you once again for joining us today, and also a very big thank you to Matthew and Samia and Tracy for joining us from IRCC. We will let you know when a recording of this webinar is available on the RSTP website, and we hope to see as many of you as possible in part 2 next Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern. So thank you once again, and have a good afternoon.